There's a particular moment that happens to every person who walks into the Schwarzwald for the first time. It's the moment when you realise that your eyes are lying to you. You've been walking for what feels like hours, but your watch says it's been 20 minutes. The path behind you has vanished, not because you can't see it, but because in the strange twilight of the Black Forest, every direction looks exactly the same. You're standing in broad daylight, but you cannot see the sky. This is when most people understand that they're not in a normal forest. They're inside the machine that builds fairy tales. For over 2,000 years, every person who has entered this forest has had the same disorienting experience. Roman legionaries who conquered most of the known world took one look at this place and called it Silva Nigra, the Black Forest, because they couldn't think of anything else to call a forest so dense that it swallowed light. Medieval travellers who crossed it whispered prayers and walked faster. The Brothers Grimm wandered these paths collecting stories that were already ancient when they found them. Stories that had been born from the simple fact that this forest does something to human perception that no other place on Earth can do. But here's what will haunt you long after this story ends: the magic was never in the forest. The magic was in what the forest did to the people who lived inside it. For centuries, entire communities existed in permanent twilight, developed languages for kinds of darkness that don't exist anywhere else, created technologies and traditions and stories that could only emerge from a place where the normal rules of human experience don't apply. Tonight you're going to experience what they experienced. You're about to walk into a forest where survival required becoming a storyteller, where the line between reality and imagination wasn't just blurred, but completely irrelevant. Because the most extraordinary thing about the Black Forest isn't that it inspired fairy tales, it's that it created a civilization that couldn't tell the difference between survival and magic and didn't want to. So turn down those lights, settle into the darkness, and prepare to enter a forest that has been turning reality into story for so long that it has forgotten which is which. You're standing at the edge of something that shouldn't exist in the modern world. It's 3 o'clock on a clear afternoon. You can see your smartphone showing full GPS signal, and yet as you peer into the darkness between these trees, you feel the same primitive fear that your ancestors felt when they first encountered predators in the night. Your rational mind knows that you're looking at perfectly normal Norway spruce and silver fir trees, but every instinct you possess is screaming that you are staring into the mouth of something ancient and hungry. This is not your imagination playing tricks on you. This is your DNA remembering what it took to survive in a world without electric lights, without clear sight lines, without the comforting presence of civilization. You are experiencing, in perfect safety, the exact same physiological response that drove human beings to create their first stories about monsters in the dark. But here's what makes this moment genuinely disturbing. You're not afraid of what might be hiding in the forest. You're afraid of the forest itself. The trees in front of you are so tall and so densely packed that they have created their own weather system. The air is different here, thicker and more humid, carrying scents that seem to come from somewhere much older than the 21st century. The light filtering through the canopy has been so filtered and scattered that it no longer resembles sunlight. It's something else entirely, something that exists nowhere else on Earth except in the deepest parts of the Black Forest. This is the environment that created every fairy tale you know, not inspired them, created them, because the people who lived in this forest didn't tell stories about magic. They lived inside magic, every single day, from birth to death. They developed technologies for navigating in permanent twilight, languages for describing types of darkness that don't exist anywhere else, survival strategies that required becoming essentially your characters in their own fairy tales. As you take your first steps into this manufactured twilight, you begin to understand something that most people never grasp about folklore and fairy tales. They weren't entertainment. They were instruction manuals. Every story about getting lost in the forest, every tale about following breadcrumb trails, every warning about trusting strange voices in the darkness was a lesson in how to stay alive in an environment that could kill you simply by making you lose your sense of direction. The path beneath your feet was carved by people who couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction, who had to memorize the feel of different types of ground cover, who learned to navigate by the sound of their own footsteps echoing off invisible tree trunks. The small wooden markers along the trail aren't quaint decorations. They're the descendants of a marking system that meant the difference between making it home for dinner and becoming another cautionary tale told around winter fires. But the most unsettling thing about walking deeper into this forest isn't the darkness or the disorientation. It's the gradual realization that your senses are adapting. Your eyes are learning to distinguish between different qualities of shadow. Your ears are beginning to pick up sounds that were always there, but that your urban-trained brain had filtered out. Most disturbing of all, you're starting to feel comfortable in this environment that should terrify you. This adaptation, this transformation from visitor to inhabitant, is exactly what happened to every generation that grew up in the Black Forest. Children who learned to walk in this twilight, who played games that could only be played in an environment where sight was unreliable, who developed social skills based on voice and touch, rather than facial expressions and body language. They didn't just live in the forest, they became part of it, developing ways of thinking and perceiving that were fundamentally different from people who lived in open landscapes. The cottage industries that made the Black Forest famous, the clockmaking and wood carving and all the rest, weren't just economic necessities. They were psychological adaptations to an environment that required a completely different relationship with time and space. When you can't rely on the sun to tell time, when the changing seasons are marked more by subtle shifts in the quality of darkness than by obvious changes in light, you develop technologies and traditions that work with different rhythms, different ways of organising human activity. The cuckoo clocks that became symbols of German craftsmanship were originally designed by people who needed mechanical devices to replace the natural time-telling systems that didn't work in permanent twilight. The precise wood carving that tourists admire today developed from the practical necessity of creating objects by touch as much as by sight, of working with materials in conditions where fine details could only be perceived through fingertips rather than eyes. But perhaps the most profound adaptation was psychological, living in an environment where the normal human senses were constantly challenged, where familiar landmarks disappeared in shifting patterns of shadow, where sounds took on mysterious qualities and distances became impossible to judge accurately, required developing mental frameworks that could handle constant uncertainty and ambiguity. The stories that emerge from this environment reflect this psychological adaptation. Black Forest fairy tales are not about clear moral distinctions between good and evil. They're about learning to navigate situations where appearances are deceiving, where the most dangerous threats often come disguised as helpful offers, where survival depends on developing intuition and judgment that goes beyond what the senses can provide. Hansel and Gretel don't defeat the witch through superior force or obvious cleverness. They survive by learning to read subtle signs and trust their instincts in situations where normal logic doesn't apply. Snow White's survival depends not on her beauty or goodness, but on her ability to form alliances with beings who exist outside normal human society. These are not fantasy stories. They're training manuals for a specific type of psychological resilience. The Romans who first marched into these woods 2 millennia ago experienced this same disorientation. They were men accustomed to the open landscapes of the Mediterranean, to territories where you could see for miles, where the sun blazed overhead and cast sharp, definite shadows. When they encountered the Schwarzwald, they found themselves in an environment unlike anything in their experience. The forest stretched before them, a solid wall of darkness that seemed to swallow light, sound, and men with equal indifference. These practical soldiers, engineers who built roads that still stand today, who conquered most of the known world through discipline and organisation, took one look at this forest and named it for its most obvious characteristic. It was black. Not metaphorically black, not evil or cursed, but literally black from the absence of light. Silva Nigra, the Black Forest, was their attempt to describe something that challenged their understanding of what a landscape should be. They had conquered deserts and mountains, rivers and plains, but here was something that seemed to exist in a permanent state of twilight, a place where the normal rules of day and night were suspended. You can imagine those first legionnaires peering into the forest depths, trying to gauge what lay beyond the first line of trees. Their eyes, accustomed to the bright light of the Roman world, would have struggled to adjust to the perpetual gloom. Every trunk could hide an enemy, every shadow could conceal a trap. The forest wasn't just difficult to navigate, it was impossible to understand. How far did it extend? What creatures lived in its depths? How could an army march through terrain where you couldn't see 20 paces ahead? The practical difficulties of the forest were staggering. Roads that worked perfectly in open country became impossible to maintain when tree roots buckled the paving stones and falling branches blocked the way. Supply lines that could stretch across continents became useless when pack animals stumbled over invisible obstacles and wagons couldn't fit between. The massive trunks, most importantly for military operations, the forest seemed to swallow entire units of men. not through any supernatural intervention, but through the simple fact that once you lost your bearings in that maze of identical trees, finding your way back to your starting point became a matter of luck rather than skill. But the Romans were practical people, and they adapted. They learned to follow the valleys where streams provided both water and guidance. They discovered that the forest, for all its intimidating appearance, was not actually hostile to human habitation. The streams were clean, game was abundant, and the same density of trees that made military operations difficult also provided perfect shelter from wind and weather. More importantly and summed, they realized that the forest inhabitants, the Germanic tribes who had learned to thrive in this environment, possessed skills and knowledge that could be valuable. These indigenous people had spent generations learning to read the subtle signs that allowed navigation through seemingly identical terrain. They knew which moss grew on which side of the trees, how to follow animal paths that led to water, where to find the clearings that provided grazing for their animals. Most importantly, they had developed a rich oral tradition that helped them remember the location of resources and hazards across the vast forest. The stories they told weren't just entertainment, they were survival guides disguised as myths. As you walk deeper into the forest, following a trail that might be centuries old, you begin to appreciate the challenges faced by the people who made this place their home. The growing season here is short, limited by the reduced sunlight and the elevation that brings early frost. Traditional agriculture, the foundation of civilization in most parts of Europe, was marginal at best. The people who settled in the Black Forest had to find other ways to survive, and those alternative strategies shaped not just their economy, but their entire world view. The long winters were the greatest challenge. For months each year, the forest became even darker. The days shortened to just a few hours of dim light, and the cold made outdoor work dangerous or impossible. Families would gather in their small wooden houses, entire extended families crowded into one or two rooms, sharing warmth and conserving resources. These were the conditions that gave birth to the cottage industries that would eventually make the Black Forest famous: the intricate wood carving, the clockmaking, the weaving and crafts that required patience, skill, and long hours of indoor work. The cuckoo clock, now a symbol recognized around the world, began as a practical solution to a survival problem. During the months when farming was impossible, when families were confined to their homes by weather and darkness, they needed activities that could produce items to trade for food and necessities. Wood was the one resource the forest provided in abundance, and the long winter nights provided the time necessary for the detailed carving and precise assembly that clockmaking required. The distinctive cuckoo call that marks the hours was not originally chosen for its charm. It was selected because it was a sound that could be produced reliably by a simple mechanical system, using technology that could be maintained and repaired by the same people who built it. But these practical adaptations only tell part of the story. The psychological effects of living in permanent twilight, of spending months each year in almost total isolation, of existing in an environment where the normal human senses of sight and hearing were constantly challenged, had profound effects on the culture that developed in the Black Forest. The people who lived here became master storytellers, not because they had more imagination than people in other places, but because storytelling served essential functions in their society. Stories helped preserve vital knowledge about survival in the forest, tales about specific locations, about the behavior of animals, about the signs that predicted weather changes, were embedded in narratives that made them memorable and ensured they would be passed from generation to generation. But stories served another equally important function. They helped people cope with the psychological stresses of life in an environment that could be beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The forest at night was a place where sounds took on mysterious qualities, where familiar landmarks disappeared, where it was easy to become disoriented and lost. The rational mind understood that these dangers were natural and explicable, but the human imagination needed a way to process the fear and uncertainty. Creating stories about supernatural beings, about creatures that lurked in the darkness, about magic both benevolent and malevolent, gave people a way to acknowledge their fears while also asserting a degree of control over them. You hear something moving in the undergrowth nearby, probably nothing more than a deer or a wild boar rustling through the fallen leaves, but in the darkness between the trees, it's impossible to be certain. This is the moment when you understand how every strange sound, every unexplained shadow, every moment of disorientation in this environment became the seed of a story. Not because the people who lived here were superstitious or primitive, but because they were human beings trying to make sense of an environment that challenged their senses and their understanding. The trail you're following leads toward one of the forest's famous lakes, Mummelsea, a body of water so dark and still that it seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. Local legend says that this lake is home to nixies, water spirits who appear as beautiful women to lure unwary travellers to their deaths. The rational part of your mind knows that this is simply a deep, glacial lake, fed by underground springs, its dark appearance caused by the same dense forest canopy that blocks sunlight throughout the region. But standing at its shore in the gathering darkness, listening to the gentle lap of invisible water against unseen rocks, you can feel the power of the story. The Nixie legend, like most folklore, contains practical wisdom disguised as supernatural warning. Deep forest lakes like this one are genuinely dangerous. Their waters are cold even in summer, cold enough to cause hypothermia within minutes. The shores can be deceptively marshy, seeming solid until someone steps too far and sinks into hidden mud. Most dangerously, the lack of light makes it nearly impossible to judge distances or depths. Someone who fell into the lake at night would have very little chance of finding their way back to shore. The story of the Nixie transforms these practical dangers into a memorable narrative. Instead of a dry recitation of safety rules, the tale provides a vivid image that captures both the danger and its cause. The lake is dangerous because it's inhabited by a beautiful woman who will seduce you to your death. The story makes the hazard memorable while also acknowledging the seductive power of the lake's dark beauty. It's a perfect example of how folklore functions as a survival technology, encoding practical knowledge in a form that can be easily remembered and transmitted. As you continue your walk through the forest, you begin to encounter other elements that found their way into the region's rich tradition of fairy tales and legends. Here is a clearing where charcoal burners once worked, tending fires that had to burn for days at precisely the right temperature to convert wood into the charcoal that was essential for metalworking. The process required constant attention, day and night, and the workers often lived in temporary shelters deep in the forest, isolated from human contact for weeks at a time. These solitary workers, blackened with soot, appearing suddenly from the smoke and shadows, easily became the inspiration for stories about forest spirits and magical beings. Their specialized knowledge of fire and metal, their ability to transform raw wood into a substance with entirely different properties, made them seem like alchemists or wizards to people unfamiliar with their craft. The fact that they worked in the deepest parts of the forest, in places where ordinary people rarely ventured, only added to their mystique. You pass the ruins of what might once have been a small mill, built beside a stream that provided the water power necessary to turn grindstones. Mills were essential to forest communities, but they were also places of mystery and sometimes fear. The constant noise of the water wheel and grinding stones could mask the approach of strangers or wild animals. The isolation necessary for water-powered machinery meant that millers often lived apart from the main settlements, making their homes vulnerable to bandits or worse. More unsettling still was the power that millers held over their communities. They controlled the processing of grain, the transformation of raw crops into usable food. A dishonest or incompetent miller could mean the difference between survival and starvation for entire villages. This combination of essential service and potential threat made millers natural subjects for folklore, sometimes portrayed as helpful figures, but just as often as sinister characters with hidden agendas. The deeper you go into the forest, the more you begin to understand how every aspect of life here contributed to the development of what would become one of the world's richest traditions of fairy tales and folk stories. The brothers Grimm, Jacob and Wilhelm, didn't invent these stories. They collected them from people who had been telling them for generations, people whose grandparents and great-grandparents had lived through the realities that the stories reflected and transformed. Take the tale of Hansel and Gretel, one of the most famous stories to emerge from this region. On the surface, it's a simple story about two children who get lost in the forest and encounter a witch who wants to eat them. But beneath that narrative lies a much darker reality, the economic conditions that could force parents to abandon their children in the woods, because they couldn't afford to feed them. The years when the brothers Grimm were collecting their stories were times of frequent food shortages and economic hardship. Crop failures, caused by unusual weather or plant diseases, could reduce entire communities to starvation. In such circumstances, families faced impossible choices: keep all the children and watch them slowly starve, or sacrifice some so that others might survive. The story of Hansel and Gretel transforms this horrific reality into a narrative where the children's resourcefulness and courage allow them to not only survive but to triumph over the forces that threaten them. The witch's house made of gingerbread and candy represents the fantasy of abundance that haunted people who lived with the constant threat of hunger. The witch herself, who fattens the children before attempting to cook them, embodies the fear that survival might require becoming the very thing you most despise. The story provides a way to acknowledge these fears while also offering hope. Intelligence and determination can overcome even the most desperate circumstances. Similarly, thus, the story of Snow White, with its themes of jealousy, exile, and eventual redemption, reflects the social realities of communities where resources were limited and competition for survival was intense. The evil stepmother who drives Snow White into the forest represents the real tensions that could develop in families where biological and step relationships created competing claims on limited resources. The 7 dwarfs, living together in their small house, working in the mines, represent the alternative forms of family and community that developed among people who had to cooperate to survive in harsh conditions. The forest in these stories is simultaneously a place of danger and a place of refuge. It threatens the protagonists with starvation, wild animals, and malevolent supernatural beings, but it also provides shelter, resources, and the opportunity to develop the skills and wisdom necessary for survival. This dual nature reflects the reality of life in the Black Forest. It was a difficult and often dangerous environment, but it was also a place where people could live independently, where they could develop their own ways of life, largely free from outside interference. You find yourself at another clearing, this one larger and more obviously artificial. Stone foundations mark the location of buildings that once stood here, probably the remains of a small settlement that was abandoned when economic conditions changed, or when the forest reclaimed what had been temporarily carved from its domain. Standing in this clearing, you're surrounded by the silent testimony of human effort and ultimate defeat. You can feel the weight of all the stories this forest has witnessed. The abandonment of settlements like this one was a recurring theme in Black Forest history. The challenging environment meant that communities were always vulnerable to changes in climate, economics, or politics. A few years of bad harvests, a shift in trade routes, a war that disrupted established patterns of life, and entire villages could disappear, leaving only stone foundations and overgrown fields to mark their passing. But these disappeared communities didn't vanish entirely. They lived on in stories, tales of ghost villages, of spirits that haunted former homes, of supernatural beings that dwelt in ruins, preserved the memory of places that had once been vital parts of the human landscape. The stories served as both memorial and warning, reminding people of their own vulnerability while also celebrating the courage of those who had tried to build lives in this demanding environment. As your walk continues, you begin to notice how the forest itself has been shaped by centuries of human habitation. What looks like virgin wilderness is actually a carefully managed landscape, the product of generations of selective cutting, replanting, and cultivation. The seemingly random distribution of different tree species reflects decisions made by foresters decades or centuries ago. The trails you're following were created by people who needed to move through this terrain efficiently, connecting settlements, workshops, and resource sites in a network that served the practical needs of forest communities. This managed landscape is itself a form of storytelling, a physical narrative about the relationship between humans and their environment. Every cleared area represents a decision about how to balance immediate needs against long-term sustainability. Every planted tree reflects someone's hope for the future, their faith that the forest would continue to provide for coming generations. The forest you're walking through tonight is not just a natural space, but a cultural artifact, shaped by centuries of human stories about what this place should be and how it should be used. The management of the Black Forest reached its most systematic form during the 18th and 19th centuries, when scientific forestry practices were developed here that would eventually be adopted around the world. These practices were based on careful observation of how the forest ecosystem functioned, combined with mathematical calculations designed to ensure that the rate of tree harvesting never exceeded the rate of regeneration. The foresters who developed these systems were essentially writing a new kind of story about the forest, one based on precise measurement and long-term planning rather than intuition and tradition. But even as the forest was being managed more scientifically, its role in the human imagination was being transformed in new ways. The 19th century brought artists and writers to the Black Forest, people who were drawn by its reputation for beauty and mystery. These visitors, often from urban areas where industrialization was rapidly changing traditional ways of life, found in the forest a landscape that seemed to represent everything that modern life was losing connection to nature. Traditional skills, communities where everyone knew everyone else. The painters who came to the Black Forest created images that emphasized its romantic and mysterious qualities. Wilhelm Haasmann and other artists of his generation painted scenes of traditional life in the forest. Women wearing the distinctive Bollenhut with its array of red pom-poms, men crafting wooden items in rustic workshops, children playing in front of half-timbered houses that seemed to come directly from fairy tales. These paintings, distributed as postcards and prints throughout Germany and beyond, created a standardized image of Black Forest life that had little to do with the economic and social realities of the region. The artist's version of the Black Forest emphasized the picturesque elements while downplaying the harshness and uncertainty that had always been part of life here. The cottage industries that had developed as survival strategies were reinterpreted as charming folk traditions. The isolation that had been a source of real hardship was portrayed as a peaceful escape from the complexities of modern life. Most importantly, the stories and legends that had served practical functions in forest communities were transformed into entertainment for urban audiences who had never experienced the conditions that created them. This transformation had profound effects on the forest and its people. As the romanticized version of Black Forest life became popular throughout Germany and beyond, tourism began to develop as a significant economic force. Visitors came seeking the fairy tale landscape they'd seen in paintings and read about in books. Local entrepreneurs responded by developing businesses that catered to these expectations, restaurants that served traditional foods, shops that sold handcrafted items, hotels that were designed to look like the cottages in storybooks. The cuckoo clock industry, which had been a practical response to economic necessity, was transformed into a symbol of Black Forest culture. Clockmakers began creating increasingly elaborate and decorative pieces specifically for the tourist market. The simple cuckoo call that had originally been chosen for its mechanical reliability became the centerpiece of complex musical and dramatic presentations. Workshops that had once produced clocks primarily for local use began marketing their products around the world, using the Black Forest's reputation for craftsmanship and authenticity. But this commercialization of tradition created a paradox that continues to shape the Black Forest today. The economic success of tourism has provided employment and prosperity for many forest communities, but it has also required them to maintain and perform a version of their culture that may have little resemblance to how their ancestors actually lived. The traditional costumes worn for festivals and tourist events are often more elaborate and decorative than anything that would have been practical for daily wear in working forest communities. The fairy tale cottages that house gift shops and restaurants are carefully maintained to look centuries old, but they're equipped with modern conveniences that would have been unimaginable to their supposed historical models. You come to a crossroads in the trail, marked by an old wooden sign whose carved directions have been worn smooth by centuries of weather. The sign points toward various destinations: a scenic overlook, a historic mill, a traditional inn where travellers have been welcomed for hundreds of years. This intersection represents more than just a choice of hiking routes. It symbolises the point where practical navigation meets cultural storytelling, where the functional need to find your way through the forest intersects with the human desire to make that journey meaningful. The inn that the sign indicates is probably real, a business that has been serving travellers for generations, but it's also likely that the inn has been modified over the years to match tourists' expectations of what a traditional Black Forest inn should look like. The food served there probably includes traditional recipes that have been adapted for modern tastes and dietary requirements. The building itself may be genuinely historic, but it's certainly been updated with modern utilities and safety features that would have been unknown to earlier generations of innkeepers. This blending of authentic tradition with contemporary adaptation is characteristic of how the Black Forest has managed to maintain its cultural identity while also participating in the modern global economy. The forest communities have found ways to preserve what they value from their past, while also embracing changes that improve their quality of life. The result is a landscape that is simultaneously ancient and modern, traditional and innovative, real and constructed. The stories that continue to emerge from the Black Forest reflect this complex identity. Modern folklore includes tales of encounters with mysterious figures on hiking trails, stories about abandoned buildings that seem to appear and disappear, legends about hidden treasures left behind by previous generations of forest dwellers. These contemporary stories follow the same patterns as older folklore. They take real phenomena, mysterious or unsettling experiences that people have in the forest environment, and transform them into memorable narratives that help make sense of encounters with the unknown. One of the most intriguing examples of how traditional storytelling continues to evolve is the way that actual historical mysteries become incorporated into local legend. The Hinterkaifeck murders of 1922, one of Germany's most famous unsolved crimes, occurred on a farm not far from the Black Forest. The brutal killing of an entire family under mysterious circumstances has spawned decades of speculation and investigation, but it has also generated a new cycle of folklore that blends factual details with supernatural speculation. Local stories now describe sightings of ghostly figures near the site of the murders, unexplained lights and sounds that suggest the presence of restless spirits, and warnings about certain areas of the forest that should be avoided after dark. These stories serve the same functions as older folklore. They acknowledge real dangers and uncertainties, while providing a framework for understanding experiences that are difficult to explain rationally. They also demonstrate how the tradition of storytelling in the Black Forest continues to evolve, incorporating new events and experiences into established narrative patterns. As you continue through the forest, you realise that you've become part of this ongoing storytelling tradition. Your walk through the Black Forest tonight, your experience of its darkness and mystery, your attempt to understand the relationship between its physical reality and its cultural reputation, makes you another link in a chain of interpretation that stretches back centuries. The stories you might tell about this experience, the way you might describe the feeling of walking through such an environment, would become part of the forest's continuing cultural evolution. The path leads you higher into the hills, toward areas where the forest gives way to alpine meadows and scenic overlooks that provide views across the Rhine Valley toward France and Switzerland. These higher elevations were always the most challenging parts of the Black Forest for human habitation, areas where the growing season was shortest and the weather most severe, but they were also places where certain resources could be found that were unavailable at lower elevations: medicinal plants, minerals, and grazing areas for livestock that could supplement the limited agricultural possibilities of forest life. The knowledge of which plants could be used for medicine, which areas provided the best grazing, which paths remained passable during different seasons, was essential for survival in these marginal environments. This knowledge was preserved and transmitted through stories that embedded practical information in memorable narratives. Tales about magical herbs that could cure illness, about fairy rings in meadows where livestock would thrive, about paths that were protected by benevolent spirits, helped ensure that vital survival information would be passed from generation to generation. Standing at one of these high viewpoints, looking out over the vast expanse of forest stretching toward the horizon, you can see the physical reality that underlies all the stories. This is genuinely one of the largest continuous forest areas in Central Europe, a landscape so extensive that it's easy to understand how it could seem infinite to people whose transportation was limited to walking or horse-drawn vehicles. The unbroken canopy stretches for miles in every direction, broken only by occasional clearings and the thin lines of streams and rivers. From this perspective, you can also see how the forest relates to the surrounding landscape. To the west, the Rhine Valley opens up toward Alsace and France, providing connections to larger trade networks and different cultural influences. To the south, the forest gradually rises toward the Swiss Alps, linking the Black Forest communities to mountain cultures with their own traditions and survival strategies. To the east, the forest eventually gives way to the more open landscapes of central Germany, where different forms of agriculture and settlement were possible. These geographical relationships help explain why the Black Forest developed its distinctive culture. It was isolated enough to develop its own traditions and ways of life, but not so isolated that it was cut off from outside influences and opportunities. The stories that developed here reflect this position. They're rooted in the specific conditions of forest life, but they also incorporate elements from the broader European tradition of folklore and fairy tales. The descent back toward the trailhead takes you through different areas of the forest, past sites that represent different chapters in its human history. Here is a clearing where a sawmill once operated, powered by a stream that has been diverted and redirected so many times that its current course bears little resemblance to its natural path. There are the remains of a kiln where lime was burned, an essential material for construction and agriculture that required specialized knowledge to produce properly. Each of these sites tells a story about human adaptation to the forest environment, about the development of technologies and skills that allowed people to extract what they needed, from a landscape that didn't easily surrender its resources. The stories associated with these places often reflect the dangers involved in such work, tales of accidents at sawmills, of workers who were overcome by fumes from kilns, of the constant risk of fire that accompanied any industrial activity in a forest environment. But the stories also celebrate the skills and knowledge that made such work possible. Tales of master craftsmen who could judge the quality of wood by its appearance, of workers who could predict weather changes by observing subtle signs in the forest, of communities that could organise complex projects requiring cooperation across extended periods of time. These stories serve to preserve and transmit technical knowledge, while also celebrating the human qualities that made survival and prosperity possible in challenging conditions. As you approach the end of your walk, you pass through areas where the forest management is most obvious. Here, different species of trees have been planted in carefully planned arrangements, designed to maximise their growth and harvest potential, while also maintaining the ecological functions that keep the forest healthy. The paths are well maintained, marked with signs that provide information about the forest ecosystem and its history. Benches and rest areas have been placed at scenic points where visitors can pause to appreciate the landscape. This managed and interpreted landscape represents the contemporary version of the Black Forest story. It acknowledges the forest's history and cultural significance while also adapting to current needs and values. The emphasis is now on sustainability, recreation, and education rather than on extraction and survival. But the underlying relationship between humans and the forest environment continues, and new stories continue to emerge from that relationship. Modern visitors to the Black Forest often report experiences that echo the traditional folklore moments of disorientation on well-marked trails, encounters with wildlife that seem almost supernatural, sudden changes in weather or light that create an atmosphere of mystery and wonder. These experiences generate contemporary stories that follow familiar patterns, tales of getting lost and being mysteriously guided back to the path, encounters with helpful strangers who disappear without explanation, moments of communion with nature that feel magical or spiritual. The trail emerges from the forest depths back to the parking area where your walk began, but the transition from the forest world back to the contemporary world feels abrupt and slightly disorienting. After hours spent in an environment where sight lines were limited, where sounds were muffled, where the normal markers of time and space were obscured, the open sky and electric lights seem harsh and overwhelming. This sensation of transition, of moving between different worlds with different rules, is itself part of the Black Forest experience that has been contributing to stories for centuries. You realise that the magic of the Black Forest isn't something that exists independently of human perception and interpretation. It's created through the interaction between a distinctive physical environment and the human need to make sense of experiences that challenge normal expectations. The forest is genuinely mysterious, not because it's supernatural, but because it creates conditions under which normal sensory experience and spatial orientation become unreliable. The stories that have emerged from centuries of human habitation in this environment serve multiple functions. They preserve practical knowledge about survival and navigation. They provide frameworks for understanding and coping with uncertainty and fear. They celebrate human qualities like courage and ingenuity, and they create cultural identity and community bonds. Most importantly, they transform the experience of living in a challenging environment from mere survival into something meaningful and beautiful. The magic of the Black Forest lies not in its conformity to the stories told about it, but in its power to continue generating new stories. Each person who walks these trails, who experiences the distinctive atmosphere of the forest, who encounters its history and its contemporary reality, becomes part of its ongoing cultural evolution. The forest changes those who enter it, not through supernatural intervention, but through the fundamental human process of making meaning from experience. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, the Black Forest continues its ancient cycle of darkness and light, silence and sound, human presence and natural process. The trees that create its characteristic twilight continue to grow, reaching toward a sun that they permit to penetrate only in carefully rationed doses. The streams continue their patient work of carving valleys and creating the clearings where human communities can take root. The wildlife continues its seasonal migrations and adaptations, following patterns that predate human presence, but that have been modified by centuries of human activity. And somewhere in that darkness, new stories are being born. Someone is getting lost on a trail and finding their way by following unexpected guidance. Someone is hearing sounds that don't match any rational explanation. Someone is experiencing a moment of connection with the natural world that will become a tale they'll tell for the rest of their lives. The Black Forest continues to weave its spell, not through magic, but through the infinitely more powerful process of human imagination transforming reality into meaning, survival into story, darkness into dreams. Sleep well, and remember that the most profound magic isn't about escaping reality, but about discovering the extraordinary within the ordinary, the meaningful within the mundane, the eternal within the everyday. The Black Forest knows this secret, and tonight, so do you.